This is a review of the 1988 Terence Davis film Distant Voices, Still Lives, which stars Pete Postlethwaite, Frida Dowie, Angela Walsh, and some other people. This is a moving film, a poetic film, and possibly a film that might not be for everyone. This is one of those movies that reminds you of just how broad the world of film is, just how many different things can be a movie. It can be astounding sometimes to watch, I don't know, some kind of fast-paced Hollywood action blockbuster or something, and then come to some much more experimental film that works in a different logic, has different priorities, and is just fundamentally different in the way it tells the story and what the story is. It is a wide world of film, and I will say that if you don't experience this astonishment, I guess is the word, from time to time, you should broaden your horizons. And this movie could be a good place to start. So if this isn't like a traditional movie, what is it? Well, there's a lot of ways to describe it. Photo album is a word that comes to mind. Snatches. Poetic. It snatches its moments from a lifetime, inherently connected to memory, recollecting, free association, things coming up from the past, things being stirred up, hopping between them. But don't think that this is a movie for one person. Don't think that this is just Terence Davies' personal childhood, photo album or something like that, although the movie is highly autobiographical and is hugely inspired by his memories, the little moments, the things that stick out. But like I said, this isn't just for him, and this isn't just for one generation. This is a movie with deeper ideas and deeper themes, ideas about life, and the twinkling of some political ideas, too. This is also just an incredibly beautiful movie in terms of how it's filmed, and it's a very interesting movie to watch because of the dramatic logic that it employs and the priorities that it has, the goals that it has. So this movie is about two sisters and a brother. It's about a family, a mother, father, two sisters, and a brother. The story is non-linear. It's told basically in free association, like memories, like an album that you're flipping through. There are plot lines you see, snatches of things that are not at all resolved in the traditional dramatic logic. For instance, there's a little scene of the family gathering in the bomb shelter during the Blitz, I assume. And normally, if you have a scene in a bomb shelter, like maybe you've seen the movie Waterloo Bridge, the movie that happens to be very popular in China. Supposedly, that's the movie that introduced the song Auld Lang Syne to China. Who knows if that's true? But in that film, the chance encounter in a bomb shelter is like a big sort of, it's kind of the inciting event to some degree. And it's dramatic to hear the sirens. It's dramatic to have everybody rush down there. And then you hold your breath. And then, there's the all clear, and you go back out and things are okay, right? There's a very clear sort of dramatic arc to a bomb shelter. But in this movie, you don't get that at all. The bomb shelter, the things that are significant there is not that everybody rushed down into it, not that it was okay, not that people held their breaths. Instead, it's something much more subtle, something remembered, something recollected from that time. A song sung in the shelter, the withered communion of the different families that are gathered together. A different significance, a different way of telling a story, and that is what marks this movie completely throughout this movie. Like I said, it's a refreshing film to watch because it has such a different dramatic logic. This is also probably a great movie to watch if you happen to have grown up in the United Kingdom in the 1950s. But I didn't, and so I'm not particularly interested in that. One of the things about this dramatic logic is that the movie lingers on interesting things you wouldn't see normally. For instance, the movie has a bit of an obsession with doors, not the Doors with Jim Morrison or anything like that, but just the average door that you'd find in between your house and the outside. And I guess doors are highly significant for a child. Doors are much like windows, the portal to the outside world or something like that. You can imagine the kid sitting by the window. You can imagine the kid waiting by the door. So these might be connected to memory. It's also worth mentioning that the first half of the movie is largely centered thematically around the father. And the door is connected to the logic of the father to some degree. A father entering and leaving through a door. A door is part of the cycle of the workday again. So anyway, door, significant. Usually movies aren't going to linger on the door. But in this film, you definitely do. The opening shot of this film, I think, is from outside, rainy day, the mother stepping outside the door to get the milk from the stoop, and in the background you hear the shipping forecast of the day, and right there you can see the shipping forecast being quite a memorable thing of the time, something that I don't think you would hear today on the radio. The rain being, an iconic English detail, and the door, and the milk, the routine, and such. The staircase plays another role in this. I won't go into it quite as long, but, parts of your house like this, they become significant when you're a kid or something like that. It's like maybe you're scared to go out into the shop or something like that, or your house has an attic, and you're always a little bit frightened by that, the stairs up to the attic or something like that. In my room growing up, I had a loft in my room. There's a ladder up to the loft, and when I was quite young, I would sometimes worry that I'd be lying in bed and I'd see some feet coming down the ladder or something like that, somebody coming up from the loft. That never actually happened, though, believe it or not. But, you can see how these things that are just wood, it's just pieces, it's just, it's just a ladder, it's just a staircase or something. These can develop deep emotional connections. And here, there doesn't seem to be any fear with the staircase exactly, but it perhaps divides the upstairs and downstairs realms, maybe a zone for the kids or something like that. You also might think of the romantic connotations of upstairs or something along those lines. I should mention that I'm describing a lot of these things in terms of childhood, but this isn't really a movie about kids exactly. There's some memories that focus on the children when they're younger. Like I said, this is just sort of a jumbled collection of memories across many different ages. Some of these are sort of younger memories. Most of them are sort of in the teenage years or adulthood, young adulthood or something like that. So it's not like they're scared of these things, but there is a lingering domesticity in this movie that's pretty interesting. You also get a number of family photos in the film. You don't see the photo exactly, but you see the shot is framed as if it is a family photo, with the family sort of standing side by side. And here, it's maybe clear why, at least one reason why these times where you're standing together for a photo might be the things that first come up into your memory, right? There's the commemorative logic of the family photo. Of course, it will be interlinked with the memories and such. This movie does depend to some degree on different events. It's clever because, when you eschew the traditional logic, you have to do some things usually to make the movie make sense and be watchable. Now, for some people, this movie will be extremely boring and they wouldn't like it at all. But there is definitely a very deliberate framing of the different time periods and things. One of the ways that they do this is by using different events, right? So Christmases, and things like that, weddings, funerals, right? And this is one of the places where the photos come in. They also do a good job of switching between time periods and showing you, based on the people's age and some crucial details, sort of where you are in the story, at least in general. That's a lot of stylistic stuff. There is significant things about the story itself, right? So I should mention that this movie's in two halves. The first half is called Distant Voices. So the movie Distant Voices, Still Lives. Turns out the first half is Distant Voices, the second half is Still Lives. And Distant Voices mainly centers around the father, Pete Postlethwaite, who's phenomenal in this movie, as usual, great actor, Pete Postlethwaite. But in this film, he plays kind of an abusive father. And some pretty extreme and moving images of him, his domineering presence over the household, over all the members of his family, are juxtaposed, are interlinked, put side by side with slightly happier memories, with these commemorative times, with Christmas Eve, with the weddings and such. And a huge amount of this recollective process is indeed the children seemingly trying to understand this and seemingly trying to process this. In the film, this juxtaposition is kind of interesting. I actually read, very briefly, I very rarely do this, but I happened to glance on IMDb at some of the user reviews for this movie, and there was one where somebody rated this movie 4 out of 10, and one of their criticisms was that for them, it really put them off the movie to have the happy moments be soured, be put right next to these abusive moments with the abusive father and such. It really turned them off the Christmas scenes and such. Okay, obviously, that's the point. And the idea is that, a childhood with an abusive father is one that is where the good times are perhaps inseparable from the bad times. Or are they inseparable? Well, it's hard to know. That is the thing that you try to process through memory and such. And this movie is the sort of stream of conscious, free associative processing of that kind of question, the understanding of the abusive father and the bleak childhood to some degree, alongside with these memories, with friendships, with siblinghood and such. That's kind of the crux of the movie and such. I mentioned, by the way, that the logic of the door and how that's connected to the father and such, the father who might be gone at some point, or there's a scene where the brother runs off or something like that. It's not exactly clear what's happened, but he wants to come back home and the father won't let him in the door and such, right? And so we talk about, the, it's a far cry from the loft in my room where I'm afraid of some hypothetical monster or something like that, to have the door of your house be imbued with such a potentially, traumatic emotional context. So, like I said, inseparable. Distant voices, what's that about? Well, partly it's a memory. It's trying to reach these things back again, but perhaps there's also some feeling of loss in this movie, some misconnection, right? The lack of an understanding with the father or something like that, a voice that was perhaps distant even when he was alive. There was already a feeling of loss or something like that. A contemplative effort. You might be bored to tears by this movie, honestly. You also might find the film, I don't know, maybe too, not exactly forgiving, but not judgmental enough, perhaps. This movie is not dramatic. This movie does not have a moral exactly that will be in your face. This is not a movie where Pete Postlethwaite gets a comeuppance. In fact, one of the things that some of the siblings try to reconcile is their is that they miss their father, and such. So a complicated movie where, like I said, they're trying to process this kind of traumatic childhood, and you really see that. Okay, first half, distant voice. The second half, still lives. Still life, interesting. I mean, the first thing it conjures would be a still life painting or something like that, which for people like me who know nothing about paintings is one of the just like stereotypical, it's what you do in a painting class or something like that. There's either a bowl of fruit or some awkward naked encounter with a model or something like that. But usually it's the bowl of fruit. It's the something very simple, something that's not dynamic, something that's not exactly exciting, something that doesn't seem to have a spark in some ways. And maybe in some ways this movie is like, the still lifes part is like that, because it is, again, focused on the quotidian and on household, the domestic, right? The domestic, lingering on the domestic. But at the same time, there are seemingly vivid internal consequences of the kind of life depicted in the first and especially the second half. So what the heck am I trying to say here? Basically, the second half of this movie is really a story of stagnation. One thing that's interesting about this movie is the use of sound in it. So first of all, the sound design itself is pretty interesting, and of course, sound and memory work together in kind of an interesting way. You have probably seen this sort of be manipulated in modern or in most sort of traditional films, perhaps when there's some sort of sound bridge into a flashback or something like that. So you go into a bit of a flashback and there's some sort of voiceover, or, you're hearing some sound from the present, and then you kind of drift back. It fades. The images fade back into time. You still hear some current sound or something like that. Or maybe you first hear like the call of a seagull, and then we see some sort of transition back into the past or something like that. That kind of thing is basically the entirety of this movie, is kind of that drifting from one thing to another where the sound is kind of loosely connected between pieces, right? Very much like a memory. Anyway, in particular, this movie could almost be called a musical because it makes a huge use of singing, having the characters actually singing in all parts of the story. At social gatherings, in the bomb shelter, like I mentioned, really at almost every point, there is song. There's probably more singing than there is talking in this movie, to be honest. And the singing is interesting. In some ways, you might say it's a simple escapism, right? One reading of the film is that in the second half, for instance, the songs are what save the characters from a stagnation or something like that. It's a pastime. It's something they can do to stay cheery or something along those lines. Escapism. But I think it's a little bit deeper than that, at least. There's a deeper kind of yearning where maybe, it wouldn't be right to say that it's the way that they just go along humming their merry songs so they can be cheerful or something. But in fact, that the songs are some reflection of a deep yearning, some distraction from something bleak or something like that. And in fact, in some ways, the bleakest parts of the movie are the singing, right? This is not some kind of musical where the camera, flies up through the roof and everybody starts singing, and it's this huge kind of escapist carnival thing. Instead, some of the songs are, despite seeming happy on the surface, in some ways some of the most harrowing parts or something like that. A phrase that really comes to mind for this movie, especially in the second half, is that all there is, which is a remarkably mature phrase. Is that all there is? A thing you may find yourself wondering in life from time to time, and especially perhaps if you were living in kind of the lower middle class in England in the 50s. Is that all there is? Interesting. Some other things in the second half of this movie, we continue to have just incredibly beautiful imagery in it. There's a scene in a movie theater in this film that is incredibly beautiful scene. The use of the music together with the cinematography in this movie is really up there for visually memorable film. I mean, you'll be hard pressed to find movies that are more carefully sort of curated and put together than this one. Really, really a beautiful movie to watch. The second half also does, to some extent, continue the pattern of the first, discussing the father. Here we start to see some matrimonial unions. They're anticlimactic, interestingly. So again, the wedding is something we've seen in many, many movies, and often the dramatic narrative of the wedding is fairly clear, right? In sort of classic movies from the 40s or 50s or whatever, a wedding usually ends the film. It is tying the knot on the story. It is restoring some sort of balanced couple formation, creating the family, fulfilling the American dream, and such. There's a great... There's a very goofy movie called The Palm Beach Story, or The West Palm Beach Story, something like that. That I won't get into it. But if you want a great movie that ends with a kind of a goofy wedding, check that out. Like I said, a lot of the times, another way you see it is the wedding that's about to happen, right? The wedding called off. This is another thing that's been milked the heck out of for dramatic purposes. Oh, she's about to marry the wrong man. Are you going to do something like this coming in at the last second? Of course, we've used this in all kinds of films, whether it be Three Idiots or Mamma Mia or something. But this movie, the weddings are completely different, like The Bomb Shelter. Here, we have anticlimactic unions. Again, almost harrowing. We've seen this in other movies where where people are kind of sad to be getting married or something like that. And this isn't exactly that. People are happy, but the message you get more or less is that all there is? This is kind of a bleak world. Anticlimactic unions. Anyway, like I said, we in some ways continue on the theme of the father by meeting some of these husbands, by further understanding the wounded man, not in a way that's sympathetic, not in a way that's justifying anything, but in a way that's raw, I guess. Some things in this film are cyclical in some ways, but I wouldn't say that they're really trying to hammer that in your face. This movie isn't really hammering much in your face. Those are some of the themes. Some things that are interesting about this movie, for me, is that this is, there are a number of movies about 1950s working class England, and it really isn't like any of them that I've seen. So, for instance, there's like the Mike Leigh film Vera Drake, I think is set in the 50s or sometime around then. Right, that's after World War II, I think, not World War I. I should mention too that this film has the specter of militarization in it as well. The brothers and the army at one point, and there's sort of the vague specter of militarization in the background. Vera Drake also has that, but a totally different kind of movie that's more of like those. That movie is in some ways, well, it's a drama, sort of a humanist, social realism drama kind of things. You also got movies from England in the 50s that were these social realist dramas, like The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner. That's a phenomenal movie. Strongly recommend it. This movie is completely different from any of those things. This is much closer to a poem. Anyway, I think you get the idea. Overall, this is a really interesting movie, and I would strongly recommend it. You'll notice from about 1 second in, I had no idea what this movie was when I started watching it. Very quickly, you realize, oh, we're in a different territory here. This is not your average kind of film or your average kind of dramatic logic, but this is a deep movie that, like I said, is not just about remembering the past, but also has remarkably profound themes of family, maybe about memory itself too. Like I said, what this process of understanding the past, trying to grapple with your father and, you know, traumatic events and something and such, through memory, the idea of a pastime, the idea of daily life, right? The construct of daily life. What is that? You know, and you could think maybe about how you'll be remembering your own times right now. Of course, maybe we don't pass the days by singing and going to the pub and drinking. Well, maybe some people. Singing, I guess, is a bit less common. But are there new things that are filling in as a pastime like that too? A desperate novelty, you know, perhaps. So really an interesting and a deep movie, I think, that I would recommend. But like I said, some people might just be completely bored to tears by this delicate and poetic movie. So that's Distant Voices, Still Lives from 1988.